In 1966, a truck company that was nearly broke bet everything on an engine that the entire diesel industry said was impossible. It worked. And it made 15 gears obsolete overnight. So here's something most people don't think about. Driving a big rig in the 1960s was a physical job, not just steering and braking, shifting, constant, grinding, relentless shifting. The diesel engines of that era had power bands so narrow you could barely sneeze without falling out of the sweet spot. We're talking maybe 300, 400 revolutions per minute of usable range before the engine either screamed past its governed speed or lugged itself into a shuddering stall. That meant 10 gears, 13 gears, sometimes 15 or even 20 forward speeds, depending on the truck and the job. And these weren't synchronized transmissions like your car. These were crash boxes, non-synchro gearboxes that required double clutching on every single shift. Push the clutch in, pull it out of gear, release, blip the throttle, clutch back in, slide it into the next gear. Miss the RPM window by 50 revolutions, and you got a sound that could make a mechanic weep from 50 yards away. The grinding of gears that weren't ready to meet, and every missed shift cost you momentum you might not get back. Now picture this. You're hauling 70,000 pounds through the Appalachian Mountains on a 2-lane road. No interstate yet in some of these places. Every grade, every dip, every change in terrain means another shift, or 2 or 3. Some of those old 2-stick transmissions, the Mack Duplex and the Spicer auxiliary setups, required both hands, literally both hands, off the steering wheel at the same time. Drivers held the wheel in the crook of their left arm while working a shift lever in each hand. The main box on one stick, the auxiliary on the other, and you had to get them both coordinated in sequence or the whole thing locked up and you were stuck in neutral on a grade with 40 tons pushing you backward. On a long haul through Pennsylvania or West Virginia, a driver might shift 400, 500 times in a single working day. Your left leg went numb from the clutch pedal. Your right arm ached from the shifter. Your back hurt from the unsuspended cab bouncing over every expansion joint in the highway. Power steering didn't exist on most of these rigs, and the engines themselves didn't care about your comfort. Cummins had their NH220 series. Detroit Diesel had the famous 671 two-stroke. Both were good engines, reliable engines, workhorses that built the American trucking industry, but they all shared the same fundamental limitation that nobody seriously questioned, because it seemed as permanent and unforgiving as gravity itself. They made their power in a narrow window near the top of the RPM range, usually between 1800 and 2100 RPM. You kept the engine there or you paid the price. Let the revs drop below about 1600, and the engine just gave up on you, like someone flipped a switch. One moment you had pulling power, the next nothing but black smoke pouring from the stack and a truck that was losing speed with every passing second. And in a loaded rig, losing speed was the beginning of a very bad chain reaction. A slowing truck meant you needed to downshift, but downshifting at the wrong moment on a grade meant you lost even more speed while the transmission passed through neutral, which meant you might need to go down another gear, maybe 2. And if you got behind the power curve in a loaded truck on a steep hill, you could end up stopped dead on a mountain in traffic, with no way to get moving again without someone pushing you or backing all the way down and trying the grade again from a running start. Drivers called it getting stuck on the hill. It happened more than anyone liked to admit. This was simply how diesel engines worked in the 1960s. Everyone accepted it. Everyone built transmissions with more gears to compensate. Add more ratios. Keep the engine in its tiny happy zone at all times. Let the driver sort it out with his left foot and both arms for 10 or 14 hours a day. Nobody thought about solving the problem at the engine level because nobody believed you could. Except 2 men at a cash-strapped truck company in Pennsylvania thought otherwise. Mack Trucks had a problem in the early 1960s, and it wasn't just philosophical, It was existential. The company that had earned the bulldog nickname building indestructible AC trucks for the British Army in World War I. The company that had built over 127,000 B-model trucks between 1953 and 66. The company, whose very name was a synonym for toughness in the English language, was running out of money. Severe cash flow problems. They were losing market share to Cummins, which had become the dominant supplier of diesel engines to the entire North American big rig market. Caterpillar was muscling in with turbocharged engines that made big power from small displacements and changed the conversation about what a truck engine could be. Detroit Diesel had the financial backing of General Motors behind it. Mack was an independent, building solid trucks, but building them with essentially the same narrow power band engines as everyone else, matched to the same 10-speed Mack duplex transmissions, competing on their hard-earned name rather than on genuine technical innovation. And reputation, no matter how deservedly legendary, only keeps the lights on for so long when the competition is outspending you and outselling you and taking your customers one fleet at a time. The man who saw a way out of this slow decline was Walter May, Executive Vice President of Product and Engineering at Mack's headquarters in Allentown, Pennsylvania. May wasn't a dreamer or a marketeer. He was an engineer and a strategist who'd been quietly studying the fundamental problem of diesel power bands for years. His idea was deceptively simple in concept and brutally difficult in execution. What if, instead of building more gears to compensate for a narrow power band, you just built a wider power band? What if you could make a diesel engine that produced useful, load-bearing torque across a range so broad that you didn't need 10 or 13 or 15 gears to keep it in the sweet spot? What if 5 gears could do the job of 13? The rest of the diesel industry would have laughed if they'd heard the pitch. Diesel engines had narrow power bands because of the fundamental physics of compression-ignition combustion, the air-fuel dynamics, the turbocharger response curves, the mechanical limits of reciprocating components under cylinder pressure. You couldn't just wish those away with ambition and a whiteboard. But May had budget authority, he had executive backing, and more importantly, he had exactly the right engineer for the job. He had Pelizzoni. Winton John Pelizzoni was chief engineer at Mack's Powertrain facility in Hagerstown, Maryland. Born April 21, 1913, in Allentown, the third of 4 sons of Joseph and Ida Pelizzoni, a Lehigh University engineering graduate, a licensed professional engineer in both Pennsylvania and Maryland, and by the early 1960s, one of the most experienced and quietly brilliant diesel engine designers in North America. He'd joined Mack in the early 1940s as a lab manager and spent the next 2 decades methodically climbing through the engineering ranks to run the entire engine design and development division. Along the way, he'd led the team that created the Thermodyne direct-injection diesel, which replaced the older Lenova design, and carried Mack's reputation for mechanical reliability and operating economy through the entire post-war era of the 50s and 60s. He was awarded numerous patents throughout his career, all relating to internal combustion engines. Colleagues and competitors would later describe him as the closest thing Mack Trucks ever had to a Thomas Edison. Quiet, methodical, soft-spoken almost to a fault, to the point where you had to lean in across the conference table to catch what he was saying. The kind of engineer who didn't give motivational speeches or make promises about what he planned to do. He just disappeared into the test cells in Hagerstown with his small team of local engineers and came back weeks or months later with data that rewrote whatever you thought you knew. Pelizzoni understood something about turbochargers that the rest of the industry had overlooked, or rather, hadn't thought to exploit in this particular way. Mack had been an early and enthusiastic adopter of turbocharging, partly to overcome a physical displacement disadvantage against the bigger Cummins engines. Mack's inline-six displaced about 672 cubic inches. Good, but Cummins was working with bigger blocks, so Mack needed forced induction just to stay competitive on raw power numbers. But turbocharging brought other benefits that went beyond the horsepower war. Better thermal efficiency meant better fuel economy per ton-mile. Lower exhaust opacity meant cleaner running, and consistent performance regardless of altitude, which mattered enormously for trucks climbing through the Rockies or the Sierras or Donner Pass, where a naturally aspirated engine could lose a quarter to a third of its rated power as the air thinned out. Pelizzoni saw one more benefit that nobody else had thought to act on. Mack's existing turbo expertise meant they could tune an engine's entire power curve, not just its peak output, by carefully matching the turbocharger's aerodynamic characteristics to the fuel injection pump's delivery schedule across the full RPM range, not just adding power at the top where the engine was already happy. Redistributing power across the entire band, moving the torque peak down, way down. What if you tuned the turbocharger to deliver increasing boost as RPM dropped instead of the usual falloff? What if you matched it with a fuel injection system that maintained full fueling volume even as engine speed fell well below where every competitor was backing off to protect their weaker internals? In theory, you could drag peak torque all the way down to 1,200 revolutions per minute, down to where drivers actually needed maximum force, down where the truck was loaded to gross weight and climbing a 7% grade, down where every other engine in America was suffocating and demanding the driver drop 3 gears. The theory was elegant. Building an engine that could survive it was the hard part. The fundamental problem with pushing peak torque down to low RPM is mechanical stress, and stress doesn't care about elegant theories. When you ask an engine to produce maximum twisting force while the crankshaft is barely turning over, each power stroke becomes a slow, brutal hammer blow instead of a quick, high-frequency tap. At 2,100 revolutions per minute, the crankshaft completes a full revolution in less than 3/100ths of a second. The combustion forces are spread across many rapid events. At 1,200 revolutions per minute, those same forces are concentrated into fewer, heavier, more violent individual pulses per second. The peak cylinder pressure on each firing event is enormous. The bending load on the crankshaft increases. Connecting rod stretch goes up. Piston pin loading goes up. Main bearing crush increases. Head bolt stretch increases. Everything inside the engine is getting hit harder and slower, which is the worst possible combination for fatigue life. Pelizzoni's team at Hagerstown essentially rebuilt Mack's inline-six from the oil pan gasket to the valve cover and everything in between. Heavier forged pistons designed to survive increased peak cylinder pressures without cracking the ringlands. Beefier connecting rods with larger bearing surfaces and more material in the beam section to resist the bending and tensile forces that the original design never had to handle. A completely redesigned crankshaft engineered specifically to damp the low-frequency torsional vibrations that are unique to high torque at low speed, where the firing impulses have time to set up resonances in the rotating assembly. More head bolts per cylinder, bigger diameter bolts. Because the cylinder heads had to stay absolutely sealed against combustion pressures that would have blown the gaskets right off any standard diesel of that era. Then came the turbocharger setup, which was the intellectual heart of the entire Maxidyne concept. They matched the turbine and compressor wheel profiles to the engine's exhaust energy map across its full operating range in a way that maintained meaningful boost pressure far deeper into the low RPM territory than conventional turbomachinery theory said was feasible. In a typical turbocharged diesel of the period, the turbo was sized for peak exhaust flow at rated speed. Drop the engine speed by 500 revolutions per minute, exhaust volume drops, turbine wheel decelerates, compressor output falls, and the cylinders start running lean. The engine chokes on its own lack of air. That's the wall. That's why 1,600 revolutions per minute was the floor for everyone else. Pelizzoni's turbo was designed to resist that fall-off. As engine speed declined and exhaust energy weakened, the turbocharger kept pumping meaningful boost into the intake manifold. And on the fuel side, the Bosch injection pump was calibrated to maintain full fuel delivery volume well below the RPM point, where every competing engine's fuel system was pulling back to protect components that couldn't handle the stress. More air, more fuel, stronger internals to handle the result. That was the formula, simple to describe, extraordinarily difficult to execute. They designated the result the ENDT 675, 672 cubic inches of inline six-cylinder, turbocharged, direct injection diesel. Mack gave it a name that would become synonymous with a revolution in trucking, Maxidyne. And when they ran it on the dynamometer for the first time and plotted the torque curve, the numbers didn't just set a new benchmark, they created a new category. 237 horsepower at 2100 RPM. That part was ordinary. Average for 1966. The Cummins NH and Detroit 671 made comparable numbers. Nobody raised an eyebrow at 237, but then you looked at the torque curve. Peak torque at 1200 RPM, 1200. Where every other engine in the heavy truck market was wheezing and begging for a downshift, the Maxidyne was sitting at maximum pulling force, 860 foot-pounds, and the horsepower curve was essentially flat, from 1700 to 2100 revolutions per minute, a power band 900 revolutions per minute wide. In a world where 400 revolutions per minute was considered perfectly normal and acceptable. The number that actually changed the industry, though, was torque rise. Every other diesel in the Class 8 market managed about 20%. The Maxidyne delivered 52. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a completely different kind of engine. Even today, more than half a century later, modern truck diesels target about 35% as optimal. The original Maxidyne from 1966 beat that number by almost half again on its first try. Quick note, if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. All right, back to it. So what did 52% torque rise feel like behind the wheel of a loaded Mack R model? It meant the engine could absorb load changes that would have stalled any competitor cold. You're climbing a grade. The truck slows. RPM drops from 1800 through 1600, where a Cummins or Detroit would be gasping and demanding you downshift immediately, through 1500, 1400, 1300. And instead of losing power and panic shifting down through 3 gears, the Maxidyne was making more torque with every 100 RPM it lost. The engine pulled harder the harder you loaded it, all the way down to 1200. It felt counterintuitive. It went against everything every truck driver had been taught since the first time he grabbed a shift lever. You had to learn to trust it. You had to fight the instinct to downshift. You let the tachometer needle drop into territory that would have killed any other engine, and the Maxidyne just dug in deeper and pulled. And this is where the matching transmission completed the revolution. If your engine covers 900 RPM of usable range, you don't need 10 gears to keep it happy. You need 5. So Mack built the Maxitorque TRL 107 specifically for the Maxidyne. A 5-speed gearbox with a triple countershaft design that was unlike anything else in the trucking industry. 3 countershafts instead of the conventional single shaft, which split the gear mesh loads across 3 parallel paths simultaneously. This gave it the highest torque capacity of any transmission in the industry while being 2/3 the physical length of its multi-speed competitors. Lighter, more compact, 1 shift lever instead of 2, 5 clean positions instead of 10 or 13 or 15. And it was built to outlast the truck it was bolted to. Old-timers used to say the scrapyards were full of Maxitorque transmissions, not because they broke, Because the trucks around them rusted into oblivion while the gearboxes sat there, perfectly functional, waiting for someone to pull them and bolt them into the next Mack. Nobody could kill them. Together, the Powertrain was a revelation. A loaded Mack R model with the Maxidyne and 5-speed Maxitorque could hold 50 miles per hour in 5th gear on a 6% grade at full gross weight. If the grade steepened and the truck slowed further, 1 downshift, to 4th, 1 shift. Crest the top at 25 in 4th gear, shift back to 5th on the downside, and cruise. That same hill in a truck with a Cummins or Detroit and a conventional 10-speed, 3, 4, 5 downshifts on the way up, 3, 4, 5 upshifts on the way down, each shift a lost beat of momentum, each shift a chance to miss a gear, each shift wearing on the driver's body and the drivetrain both. And on the downslope, Mack had another answer. In 1971, they patented the Dynatard engine brake. The first compression brake designed and manufactured by a heavy-duty diesel engine manufacturer, not a third-party supplier like Jacobs. The Dynatard held exhaust valves cracked slightly open during the compression stroke, converting the engine into an air pump that resisted the vehicle's forward motion. Combined with the Maxidyne's broad power band, it gave drivers engine braking through a range of speeds that competitors couldn't touch without bolting on additional hardware. Jim Windsor, a respected diesel industry journalist, got behind the wheel of a Maxidyne prototype in '66 with Mack engineer Bob Zalakar riding shotgun. They ran through the hills of central Pennsylvania. Windsor wrote about it later, and what stuck with him wasn't the horsepower number or the torque rise percentage. It was the quiet, not engine quiet, shifting quiet. The absence of that relentless percussion of gear changes that had defined every truck ride he'd ever taken. You just drove. The engine sorted out the terrain. A loaded rig cruised from 36 to 63 miles per hour in a single gear without the driver's hand going near the shift lever. In 1966, that was as close to science fiction as trucking got. Now, the early Maxidyne wasn't flawless. Problems surfaced quickly. Camshaft wear was the first headache, especially on engines equipped with the Dynatard, where the compression brake's additional valve train forces, combined with the Maxidyne's already punishing low RPM loads, ate through cam lobes faster than anyone expected, solved with harder metallurgy and revised cam profiles, but it scared some early adopters. Rear block cracking was a more persistent concern. Drivers and shops that pushed fuel delivery screws beyond factory settings to extract more power found that the intense, slow-frequency torque pulses could set up vibration patterns that eventually grew stress cracks in the casting near the rear of the block. Not a widespread failure mode, but well known among experienced Mack mechanics, and a reminder that even the Maxidyne had limits if you tried to cheat them. The V8 version, the ENDT 865, introduced in '69, had its own problems. 285 to 325 horsepower depending on configuration. But the V8 Maxidyne suffered persistent head gasket failures. The lugging driving style that a 5-speed encouraged, exactly the operating mode the engine was designed for, put severe thermal cycling stress on the head gaskets that the V configuration handled less gracefully than the inline-six. Some veteran Mack dealers in the '70s privately steered customers toward the conventional ENDT 866 V8 instead. It had a narrower power band and you needed more gears, but the gaskets stayed put. In 1973, the inline-six was upgraded to the ENDT 676 with air-to-air intercooling, 285 horsepower, 1,080 foot-pounds of torque. That engine became an absolute fixture in the construction and vocational truck world. Cement mixers grossing 75 tons, tandem and tri-axle dump trucks, logging rigs hauling old growth through the mud in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of work where you're constantly starting, stopping, climbing grades, crawling through muck, And the last thing you want is to be wrestling a 10-speed gearbox with both hands while keeping a loaded mixer from rolling backward down a job site ramp. The competitive response was swift and industry-wide. Cummins, watching Mack steal fleet customers with a powertrain that cut driver fatigue and shifting in half, developed their own high-torque rise engines under the custom torque label and paired them with 7-speed transmissions. It was Mack's success that forced their hand. Caterpillar released high-torque rise versions of the 3406. Detroit Diesel eventually followed. Within a decade, every major diesel engine manufacturer on the continent was rethinking its approach to torque curves because two engineers at a financially struggling company in Pennsylvania and Maryland had proven that torque rise wasn't a fixed physical law. It was a design choice, and choosing differently could eliminate half the gears in a truck and half the work from a driver's day. Mack's financial situation reversed with remarkable speed. Signal Oil and Gas Company acquired Mack Trucks in 1967, the same year the Maxidyne entered full-scale production. That timing was not coincidental. A struggling truck builder with a revolutionary powertrain and a suddenly full order book is an extremely attractive acquisition target. With the Maxidyne and Maxitorque as their calling card, Mack became the dominant truck for fleets across North America through the 70s and deep into the 80s. The Bulldog was back and more dominant than it had been since the war years. But the world kept changing. By the mid-1980s, fleet managers were studying fuel bills more carefully than ever. Oil wasn't cheap anymore, and running the Maxidyne up to its 2100 RPM governed speed burned more diesel per mile than the newer low RPM engines that competitors were introducing. Mack responded by developing a version governed at 1800 revolutions per minute, trimming the power band back to about 600 revolutions per minute. And in doing so, they essentially wrote the template that every modern heavy truck diesel still follows today. Lower governed speed, higher torque at lower RPM, broader torque rise, fewer gears needed. If you've ever watched a modern Mack or Kenworth or Peterbilt cruise the interstate at 65 miles per hour with a 12-speed automated manual and a big diesel making peak torque at 1200 RPM, you're watching the Maxidyne's direct descendant at work. The 90s brought higher speed limits across the country and drivers demanding more power to keep up. The six-cylinder Maxidyne topped out at 300 horsepower, and that wasn't enough for interstate work anymore. Mack's higher RPM conventional Econodyne and Maxi Cruise engines took over highway duty. But in vocational work, the Maxidyne's territory, dump trucks and mixers and logging rigs and refuse haulers, nothing else came close. The Maxidyne held that ground for decades because no other engine could match its combination of low-end grunt and shift-free operation in stop-and-go climb-and-crawl applications. Then the ownership changed for the last time. Around 2000, Volvo acquired both Renault Véhicules Industriels and Mack Trucks in a package deal. The six-cylinder Maxidyne got one final horsepower bump to 370 in 2004, but by 2007, Mack's own engines were being replaced by Volvo-designed units wearing red paint and a bulldog hood ornament. The legendary Maxitorque transmissions were phased out in favor of Volvo's automated manual gearboxes. The engine that had reshaped the global trucking industry was retired without ceremony, replaced by descendants that carried its DNA in their torque curves, even if they didn't carry its name. Walter May died in March of 2015 at the age of 97. He'd been inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. He held more than 22 patents in the United States and multiple foreign countries. The Society of Automotive Engineers had elected him to fellow membership, a distinction reserved for those who reach exceptional professional standing. Win Pelizzoni passed away on March 18, 2011, also at 97. After retiring from Mack in 1978, where he'd risen to vice president of engineering for product development, he consulted for the Penske Indy Cars racing operation and other firms. His obituary in the Allentown Morning Call described the Maxidyne as the greatest breakthrough in diesel technology since the invention of the diesel engine itself. Former colleagues from across the industry remembered him as soft-spoken, kind, genuinely modest. The closest thing to a Thomas Edison that Mack ever had. The kind of man who could fundamentally transform an entire global industry and never once raise his voice to do it. Two engineers at a nearly bankrupt truck company looked at a problem the entire world had been working around for decades, and instead of adding complexity, they subtracted it. 5 gears. That was their answer, and it changed everything that came after. And there you have it. The Mack Maxidyne, the engine that made 15 gears feel like overkill. If you ever rode in one, or your old man drove one, or you watched one haul concrete up a grade in a gear that shouldn't have worked, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more of these. We do this every week.